Thank you, thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft Singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft Singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft Singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate, just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
My buddy Paul showed me how not to get mugged. From when we were like 6, he would always talk about, if I'm going to get robbed, I'm going to get completely naked. When we were 17, I finally was there when we got to test this theory, and God, it was glorious. We were walking through a park called Tilbury Park in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. A man stepped from behind the trees, he had a knife, and he went, "Hey, give me your money." And I said, I don't know what I said, but then I just heard the telltale sound of a belt undoing. And then I heard a man holding a knife go, "Why are your pants off?" And then my friend Paul said in a tone of voice that made a robber shudder, he went, "I'm trying something, be quiet." The mugger then dropped his knife and ran away. That worked so well, we ended up technically mugging a mugger.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Bad News Thursday, September the 5th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have the patriotic shorts, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, 33 Strategies of War, Motivation, and Bad News. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now the Southern California weather.
Putting this into practice right now, we got this heat wave.
This heat doesn't bother me at all,
I was just thinking
Brianna. I think it's great.
Perfect
We love
timing.
it.
John, do you really think it's great? I know
Yeah,
you live
I'm trying to be positive.
you live in a very hot area too, and
I stay in the air conditioning. It's great.
yeah,
Right.
these valleys. I mean, we'll just pray that all of our air conditionings make it through this week, because my goodness, if they don't. The overnight temperatures, 85 degrees over in Woodland Hills. I just want to start off with these temperatures so you can see how warm it's been overnight, and that we haven't cooled off past this. It's about 80 degrees in Van Nuys, 80 in Burbank. Hopefully we'll get into the upper 70s for these areas. I'm not sure about Woodland Hills as we get closer to sunrise. We will cool off a little bit more until then. 80 degrees over into Ontario, and so we do have many very warm spots this morning. Tomorrow now expected to be the hottest day for many of us. So we are slowly getting there, but today is still going to be brutal. We have excessive heat warnings that have been extended into Saturday night now, but I'm going to show you some of the temperatures today, and you will want to stay indoors as much as possible in the air conditioning. Now, we do only have that still one spot out of a heat advisory that is over into Ventura. So if you want to get out of the heat today, Ventura Beach, that is the only place you can go. We even have excessive heat warnings that are extended into the coastline. Fire weather watches have now been issued, which get upgraded to red flag warnings if the conditions stay until we get closer to the moment it gets issued. These areas for some of the mountains and foothills, anywhere from 98 to 108 degrees. We have not crazy gusty winds, but we do have enough of a breeze, about 15 to 25 miles per hour. Gusts possible up to about 30, and then relative humidity levels anywhere from about 8 to 15% at the minimum. So it's going to be dry. It's going to be a little breezy. And with that heat, it's enough for us to potentially issue the red flag warning as it gets a little closer for the National Weather Service too. Here's this huge ridge extending all the way up into the Pacific Northwest and even past that. And that is going to bring these temperatures to be pretty hot today. And once again tomorrow, we'll finally get cooling by the weekend. It's not going to be a whole lot though. I mean, we'll take what we can get. It's still going to be feeling very, very uncomfortable. 110 in Riverside today, San Bernardino, 113 degrees, 111 in Lake Elsinore, Orange County, Anaheim, 102, Ontario, 109 degrees, 106 over in Encino, even the foothills, Pasadena, Glendale hot today, 104. Northridge, 113 degrees, Santa Clarita at 112, and Ojai getting up to about 107, even Ventura getting into some low 90s today. So for Los Angeles and Orange County, we're going to get into that triple-digit heat. For some areas today, a little more so tomorrow. You can see we're still away from some of those record-breaking temperatures that we saw, especially in 2020. Then we get into this weekend, still pretty hot. Finally, next week, we have 80s returning by next Wednesday. The longer-range models are showing we do get a nice cool-down next week, but we have several more days to go. The Valleys and Inland Empire, hottest area, getting up to 115 degrees today. 117 is possible for Woodland Hills tomorrow, and then down to about 113 Saturday. Sunday, still very hot at about 107 degrees. It's not until about midweek next week it will start to feel more comfortable. Even the beaches are going to be warm. We get up to 86 degrees on your Friday, staying in the mid-80s this weekend. Then finally we will have some 70s returning next week, but not many places to go to get some relief as we get into the next several days and even the weekend. Scott Reif now with a look at your traffic this morning. It's a warm one out there, Scott.
And that was the Southern California weather. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, thunderstorm and fireplace. Rain, Thunderstorm, and Fireplace. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the patriotic short.
Happened when the Taliban crossed Clifford, the big red devil dog. After a hearty breakfast, Corporal Clifford Wooldridge and his Marine buddies found themselves deep in Afghanistan when their Humvee struck an IED. Barely escaping to a second vehicle, they were hit again, and that was just the morning. Their convoy pressed on through Musa Qala, a notorious Taliban stronghold where heroin fields were fiercely defended. Soon enough, enemy fire erupted from the mountains ahead and an abandoned village to the side, hammering the Marine convoy with RPGs and automatic weapons. The Humvee turret gunners fired back with a relentless barrage of 50 caliber rounds. But Clifford, the big red devil dog, had enough of the Taliban's games. Grabbing his M249 saw, he charged up an open hill chasing 15 Taliban, cutting down 9 with a hailstorm of 5.56, but the fight was far from over. Wooldridge heard voices beyond a nearby wall and reacted instantly. He swung around the corner, unleashing a burst from his saw and dropping 3 more enemies. Out of ammo, he reached for a reload just as an AK-47 barrel appeared around the wall. What would Clifford, the big red devil dog, do? Well, Clifford grabbed that barrel and beat that Taliban to death with the butt of his own rifle.
And that was the patriotic short. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, a little bit of motivation.
What can you do, Les? When you have been telling yourself you can reach a goal, and you've been affirming, I am abundant, I am rich, I feel better than good and better than most, I am blessed and highly favored, I can make it, I'm a winner, and you losing every day. Life whipping your butt every day. What do? When you've lost your spirit, you've lost your job, you lost everything, life been devastating. What if you give it everything you have and you come up short? What if you get weak along the way and you throw in the towel on yourself? You surrender to your emotions. What then? A lot of people become discouraged. They become frustrated and they say, oh, what the heck? And they go back to doing what they were doing before, saying it doesn't work. Come on, be real, man. Come on, get a life. You can't do that. You can't come back from that. Life is like a grindstone. It can polish you or it can pulverize you, depending on how you position yourself.
The victim looks at failure and gets knocked down. The leader looks at failure and asks themselves, what's the opportunity here?
It's the only way to learn. Michael Jordan, he took 946 game-winning shots. He has only made 146 of those. You know what they write about? When you make it. They write about when you make it. Matter of fact, when you fail, be glad about it. Every time you fail, you're one step closer.
Most people stop short of their dreams and park and get off the highway of life because of the rejections of life. You will always be rejected. I need you to evaluate yourself and ask yourself the question, how are you wired? When you have a trial or a tribulation, how are you wired? When you hear the word no, does it break you? I'm wired differently. I get excited about no. I love no. No, Eric, you can't do it. You're a high school dropout. I'll be back. I'll be stronger when I come back.
Every no you get, don't shun the no. Every no you take the no and you recycle it. You hold on to it. You embrace every no and you let each no make you callous to no. You get so strong that when you hear no, it turns you on.
Make no your vitamin. Get excited about the no. Why? Because every time someone says no, that brings you another step to a yes. You're getting closer. Trust me, you will win if you don't quit. People say, it seems like you're stronger now. You're more committed now. It seems like your drive is higher now. Your passion is higher now. What happened, E.T.? Because every time they close the door, I just get excited. Why? Because I am not a no. I'm one yes away. You can't keep telling me no forever. You can't keep denying me forever. This type of energy, this type of passion, you can't stop it. You can contain it for a while, but you cannot stop it. You can't defeat me. Life is a fight for territory. And once you stop fighting for what you want. What you don't want will automatically take over.
It's a fight for integrity. It's a fight for character. It's a fight for a good reputation, your goals, your dreams, your ambitions, because they don't give you those things when you're born. So every morning, I've got to wake up and I've got to fight. I got to fight for my dreams. I got to fight for character. I got to fight for integrity.
I have to exercise every day. I have to drop out of my bed and do 100 push-ups every day. I have to discipline my eating. I have to turn off the news. I can't watch the news. I'm fighting for my health.
You've got to continue to work on yourself personally. You've got to decide to be relentless. You've got to decide never to give up. You've got to find some reasons within yourself that will give you the stamina when life catches you on the blind side to get back up again, to keep on calling and coming back again and again and again.
There's somebody else in you back there. And as you work toward becoming that person, who you are right now must die daily. You got to kill that person off. You got to be willing to give up who you've been for who you can become.
If you don't learn how to flourish under fire, you won't flourish at all. In fact, many times, the greater the opposition, the closer you're getting to your goal.
Dreams are fertilized, not in the nice, convenient places, not when everything's going well. It's in the dark places. It's in the rough places that dreams are fertilized. So if you avoid the dark and rough places, you're avoiding the very fertilization of the next move in your life.
It may take a long time, but if you just keep doing right, if you just stand your ground and be dedicated, if you keep pushing forward, you can lose weight, you can get in shape, you can go back to college, you can overcome anything.
And you got to declare to yourself, whatever it takes, I'm going to pay the price. I'm going to do it when things go right. I'm going to do it when things go wrong. I'm going to do this. I'm going to be consistent. I'm going to show up every day. I'm going to make a little dent in it every day. I'm going to hit it every day. I'm going to swing every day. You can count on me to take action.
You're going to quit, or you're going to make it to your goal. You're going to quit, or you're going to make it to yourself. You're going to quit, or you're going to stand there and do what you got to do to make your dreams become a reality.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Daily Stoic.
To each his own. Another has done me wrong. Let him see to it. He has his own tendencies and his own affairs. What I have now is what the common nature has willed, and what I endeavor to accomplish now is what my nature wills. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations 5.25. Abraham Lincoln occasionally got fuming mad with a subordinate, one of his generals, even a friend. Rather than taking it out on that person directly, he'd write a long letter outlining his case, why they were wrong, and what he wanted them to know. Then Lincoln would fold it up, put the letter in the desk drawer, and never send it. Many of these letters survive only by chance. He knew, as the former emperor of Rome knew, that it's easy to fight back. It's tempting to give them a piece of your mind. But you almost always end up with regret. You almost always wish you hadn't sent the letter. Think of the last time you flew off the handle. What was the outcome? Was there any benefit?
And that was The Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
What makes you happy is seeking, above all, God's will for you, which is righteousness, which is right order. Once you've found that, Jesus is implying, the other dimensions of your life will tend to fall into right harmony and order around it. Go back to the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And there's that same idea. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. So should I be seeking first food and drink and sex and shelter and comfort? No. Seek first the kingdom of God. Should I seek first even like intellectual attainment? No, that's fine. But seek first the kingdom of God. And then the rest will be given unto you. Your life will now find its proper harmony and order.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Thank you. And now from the First Church of Ayn Rand. Quote, "The exponents of modern movements do not seek to convert you to their values. They haven't any, but to destroy yours. Nihilism and destruction are almost explicit goals of today's trends, and the horror is that these trends move on unopposed. What is the solution and the antidote? Its name is objectivism." Unquote. It's Ayn Rand, Our Cultural Value Deprivation, from the book The Voice of Reason. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the 33 Strategies of War.
In 1802, what today is Haiti was a French possession riven by a revolt of the country's black slaves under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture. That year, an army sent by Napoleon to crush the rebellion managed to seize Toussaint through treachery and ship him off to France, where he would eventually die in prison. Among Toussaint's most decorated generals was a man named Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who now surrendered to the French and even served in their army, helping them to put down isolated pockets of revolt and winning from them much appreciation. But it was all a ploy. As Dessalines squashed these remnants of the rebellion, he would hand over the weapons he captured to the French, but secretly, he always kept some of them back, stashing them away until he had quite a large armory. Meanwhile, he built up and trained a new rebel army in the remote areas where his assignment led him. Then, choosing a moment when an outbreak of yellow fever had decimated the French army, he resumed hostilities. Within a few years, he had defeated the French and liberated Haiti for good from colonial control. Dessalines' use of passive aggression has deep roots in military strategy, in what can be called the false surrender. In war, your enemies can never read your thoughts. They must make your appearance their guide, reading the signs you give off to decipher what you are thinking and planning. Meanwhile, the surrender of an army tends to be followed by a great flood of emotion and a lowering of everyone's guard. The victor will keep an eye on the beaten troops, but exhausted by the effort it took to win, will be hugely tempted to be less wary than before. A clever strategist, then, may falsely surrender, announce that he is defeated in body and spirit. Seeing no indication otherwise, and unable to read his mind, the enemy is likely to take his submission at face value. Now the false surrenderer has time and space to plot new hostilities. In war, as in life, the false surrender depends on the seamless appearance of submission. Dessalines did not just give in. He actively served his former enemies. To make this work, you must do likewise. Play up your weakness, your crushed spirit, your desire to be friends, an emotional ploy with great power to distract. You must also be something of an actor. Any sign of ambivalence will ruin the effect.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War. Back in a minute. Thank you. So you may as well, if you're a Democrat, you may as well vote Republican. And the reason is because you're not being given any option. Kamala Harris is becoming more of a Republican than a Democrat. She's not providing clear difference from the Republicans. She keeps co-opting the ideas that Donald Trump has come up with first. So, as Harry Truman once said, if you give the people a choice between voting Republican and voting Republican, they'll vote Republican every time. Back in a minute.
was sort of watching this, holistically. What is she saying? What does she look like? What's on the screen? So at the beginning, when she's talking about Biden and their record, our screen said, this is called the Chiron, the headline at the bottom. It said, Harris stands by Biden administration economic record. She is making it clear that she will embrace and be a continuation of Biden's economic policy, his record, what they've done. She offered no remorse, no regrets, no introspection about anything they've done. She continued to blame inflation on this fantasy price gouging idea. She had no additional thoughts on the economic situation in the country or what they've done beyond just saying, Joe Biden and I have done a great job. Now, if I were the Trump people, I would be salivating over the idea that that's how they are going to run the race. I don't believe it's tenable. I also thought it was interesting that she didn't take any responsibility at the end for telling the American people that Joe Biden was fine and he was strong. When we all know that's not true. That's why he's out of the race, and she's still standing by the idea that he was fine and he's strong and that he's fine today. Nobody believes that, and I just think at some point, then why isn't he running?
Are you or your loved ones suffering from illnesses such as TDS, also known as Trump derangement syndrome? Do you dismiss or deny the current issues facing our country, such as historic inflation, illegal immigration, corporate corruption, World War III escalations, and the chronic disease epidemic? Are you willing to elect someone who was the least popular vice president in modern history, and who offers no policy or vision for America simply because your brain keeps telling you anyone but Trump? If so, you might be struggling from TDS. Introducing Independence. Independence allows you the freedom to finally think independently once again. Instead of believing everything you hear from the mainstream media, Independence allows for constructive critical thinking.
I used to hear people on the news say things like,
Donald Trump and the movement he has encouraged are a threat to democracy.
And I instantly believed it. With Independence, I now realize the media is run by the Democrat elite, who are a corrupt oligarchy that censors free speech, silences political opponents, supports forever wars, and abandons democracy by anointing its candidates.
Independence may not be for everyone. If you enjoy being lied to about your president's cognitive abilities, support Orwellian totalitarianism, or are excited about communist fiscal policy, Independence may not be right for you. Common side effects of Independence may include an awakening of rational thought, successfully identifying propaganda, freedom of choice, loss of hatred, anti-narcissistic behavior, and love of democracy.
I used to blindly hate whoever my party was running against. I didn't care about facts or policy because I was hopelessly indoctrinated. With Independence, I'm much more interested in policies that uphold democracy, and I truly care about the health of our country and its citizens.
Ask your doctor if Independence is right for you, and enjoy your freedoms once again.
I'm sorry, I am so tired of the tens of thousands of just hard fours online being like, I'm voting for her because he's going to strip all of our rights away as a woman. I can't do that as a mom and a da-da. What rights, babe? What rights? He was already president, and how many rights did you lose? 0. He's trying to protect women's rights. What do you think it is when we have men in women's sports? We have men in our personal spaces. What do you think it is when dangerous men come over the border? That's what protecting women and children is. Oh, he already said he's not going to do a nationwide abortion ban. He's not going to do it. If anything, it's going to be state by state the way it has been. And guess what? If a state, 90% of people in a state want something, I think that state should have it, even if I don't agree with it. If you don't like it, move to another state. It's very simple. Stop with the propaganda. This is why people make fun of women. Use your brain. Use your brain, babe.
Kelly Barnett invited the former president to Arlington. Her son, Marine Staff Sergeant Taylor Hoover, died at Abbey Gate. What would you say to people who may be pro-Trump, anti-Trump, whatever their politics might be, who just feel like that's not a place for politicians or for politics?
I would have to say, are you in my shoes? I invited him. My son was murdered under the Biden-Harris administration.
Thank you, Mr. President. And the last time you called me up on stage in Grand Rapids, it was the first rally that you'd held since the assassination attempt. And I was speechless. But tonight, I want to say a couple things real briefly. I represent the Auto Workers for Trump organization, which was a Facebook group. I started that group. Thank you. There's some auto workers here, I'm sure. Lansing got a lot of them. But unfortunately, a lot of them have lost their jobs. Listen, Chrysler and General Motors have already gone bankrupt once. But if we allow electric vehicle mandates to be put on this industry by the federal government, they're going out of business again. We got to fight against that. And this guy standing right here is the only person who will do it. We cannot allow the federal government to put mandates on the auto industry to build electric vehicles when the consumers do not want them. So I'm asking everybody, I'm asking auto workers, and I'm asking everybody that supplies the auto industry, get 10 or 15 of your friends, make sure they get out and vote. Our very survival depends on it, and we can't allow it to happen. So vote Trump and J.D. Vance, and we'll turn this country around. He's done it once. Unfortunately, he's going to have to go back and do it again.
We had a Trump Force 47 captain conference call last night, and it covered some interesting things. One of those being that RFK Jr. is not the first endorsement that is going to be huge coming from the Trump campaign. We just saw Tulsi. She just endorsed him, and that was huge. But I want to tell y'all that there is more coming. There are some huge endorsements coming along the way. And if this does not get you excited and encouraged, I don't know what will.
And don't you want a president who's going to get us out of the wars and who's going to rebuild the middle class in this country? And he told me that he wanted to end the censorship because the whole basis of American democracy is the free flow of information. And we know that a government that can silence its opponents has license for any kind of atrocity. And can you think of any time that you can look back in history and say that the people who were censoring were the good guys? They're always the bad guys, because it's always the first step down that slippery slope to totalitarianism. And don't you want a president who's going to protect America's freedoms? And who is going to protect us against totalitarianism? And I want to ask you again, don't you want a safe environment for your children? Don't you want to know that the food that you're feeding them is not filled with chemicals that are going to give them cancer and chronic disease? And don't you want a president that's going to make America healthy again? Thank you all very, very much, and God bless you, and God bless America.
Thank you. And now from the X account, Israel Kicks Ass. In Tubas, in eastern Samaria, Mohammed Zabidi, son of terrorist Zachariah Zabidi, and 3 other senior terrorists, including the son of the commander of the Islamic Jihad in the city, were eliminated. Thank you. And now we're going to have bad news, and it's going to be the second half of Chapter 6, The Lesson of the Trump Era.
Russiagate was certainly a big part of the media's response to Trump.
But it was only one of the obsessions that would animate the coverage of the former president. The other was the idea that Trump is a reflection of America's persistent, enduring, state-sponsored white supremacy. Unlike with the narrative about Russia, the white supremacy narrative took time to develop. In the immediate aftermath of the election, books like J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy and Nancy Eisenberg's White Trash soared to the top of the bestseller list as blind-sided liberals sought to understand how people could have cast a vote for Trump. And for a brief period at the end of 2016, a window opened up in which the American mainstream seemed like it might truly grapple with the question of class. But these attempts to understand how so many of their fellow Americans could think so differently from them, and how the media could have gotten the story so wrong, quickly disappeared in favor of an easier explanation. Trump's voters were all racist. This idea, which came to full flower after the 2016 election, that every Trump voter was a racist, Hillary's formulation that they're a bunch of deplorables, I do think that was absorbed right into the DNA of the New York Times, Michael Powell, the Times reporter, told me. There are people who cut the other way, so it isn't to say there's a party line, but it's certainly true that a lot of reporters and editors thought, holy shit, we live in a country that is half fallen, that's just tarred by racism and sexism and so on. It is no doubt true that some of Trump's voters were motivated by racial animus. After all, there are racists in every sector of society. And certainly Trump did all he could to confuse the matter, refusing, whenever possible, to distinguish himself from white nationalists and other racist elements in society. His language all too often veered into ugly stereotypes and even outright racism. But this didn't stop millions of people of color from voting for him, a number that grew significantly between his 2016 and 2020 campaigns. Were they, too, all racists? The answer is yes, according to the New York Times columnist Charles Blow. Some people who have historically been oppressed will stand with their oppressors, he wrote after the 2020 election results came in. As evidence of the racism of all Trump supporters, the liberal news media became inundated with study after study allegedly proving that the story of class, that Trump's voters had chosen him out of economic anxiety, was false. They were simply racist, we were told in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and Vox. It was cultural anxiety that drove white working-class voters to Trump, was the headline of a 2017 article in The Atlantic. Or, as the New York Times would have it, Trump voters driven by fear of losing status, not economic anxiety, study finds. Economic anxiety didn't make people vote Trump. Racism did, The Nation explained. The past year of research has made it very clear. Trump won because of racial resentment, is how Vox put it in 2017. And then again in 2018, in a second article purporting to prove the racism of people who had first voted for Obama and then switched parties and broke for Trump. You can feel the relief seeping through the endless repetition. After all, if Trump's voters were motivated by racism, we no longer have to care about them. It completely absolves journalists of the inner twinge of doubt that must come to any honest reporter when they realize that they are afflicting the afflicted. There is only one problem with this story. It's just not true. A closer examination of those studies reveals a much more complex picture. The studies used to determine racial animus frequently fail to actually measure racism. More often what they measure is insufficient liberalism on questions of race. For example, to measure the alleged racism of Trump supporters, one study determined people's racism according to whether they support affirmative action or not, even though over half of Black Americans don't. Can something that splits the Black community down the middle really measure racism? It also asked whether the government should make every effort to improve the social and economic position of Blacks, or if they should help themselves. But this question, too, has nothing to do with racism. According to this logic, a libertarian who thinks that the government should help no one at all would be classified alongside David Duke and Richard Spencer. Clearly not a morally serious proposition. Another study asked if generations of slavery and discrimination have lingering effects for Black Americans and how much influence Blacks have in the national conversation. The latter question does suggest racial animus, but surely someone can be wrong about the lingering impact of slavery without being racist. And yet researchers combined the answers to all their questions to create a racial resentment rating. But these ratings obscure important things, like the fact that Republicans who view the world through a lens of personal responsibility will naturally tend to underplay systemic racism, while liberals who emphasize government support tend to overplay it in an equally inaccurate way, as many sociologists have noted. Another often used scale includes 3 statements with which respondents rate their level of agreement to figure out if they are racist. I am angry that racism exists. White people in the U.S. have certain advantages because of the color of their skin, and racial problems in the U.S. are rare, isolated situations. One could argue that not being angry that racism exists is a true marker of racism. But the other 2 statements are much more ambiguous. Is it racist to deny white privilege or just foolish? Is it racist to believe racism is rare? Once again, the researchers bundled these 3 questions into a single dimension, meaning someone who is livid about racism but doesn't feel it's very prevalent would be ranked at the same level as someone who is just miffed about racism but sees it everywhere. Certainly none of these assertions seem to be a good measure of racist resentment, as the paper citing the study purports. In another widely covered study published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which received coverage in The New York Times, The Economist, Slate, CNN, and The Atlantic for purporting to prove that it was racism, not economics, that motivated Trump voters, political scientist Diana Mutz used what are clearly economic measures to arrive at conclusions about a status threat. Mutz asked people how they felt about trade agreements with other countries and whether they saw China as an opportunity or a threat. She determined that people who opposed trade agreements and saw China as a threat feared a status threat on the grounds that because white male Christians are seen as most prototypically American, they have the most to lose psychologically if they perceive America and or whites to be no longer dominant. This attempt to torque a purely economic question about trade into one about racial status is both ridiculous and all too common. The only status threat mentioned in the study, not related explicitly to economics, shows up in the study's claim that when it comes to Trump's voters, you can find increasing anxiety among high status groups rather than complaints about past treatment among low status groups, with high status Americans defined as whites, Christians, and men. But are all white Christian men high status? Certainly many downwardly mobile white Christian men in failing former manufacturing communities where opioid addiction is still skyrocketing would not see themselves as high status. Is it racist of them that they feel forgotten, left behind, and abandoned? More importantly, Mutz found no correlation between the discrimination some Trump-voting white male Christians feel and prejudice against minorities. And yet, she titled her findings, Status Threat, Not Economic Hardship Explains the 2016 Presidential Vote, suggesting that the status threat she was referring to is a threat to white dominance. It's not a threat to their own economic well-being. It's a threat to their group's dominance in our country overall, Mutz told the New York Times. What Mutz's data actually shows is that there is a difference between economic hardship and economic anxiety, as Musa Al-Gharbi explains in an essay in The American Sociologist. Al-Gharbi's essay meticulously chronicles how much of the research on this topic is deeply flawed and steeped in prejudicial study design, confirmation bias, a desire to make the data fit the researcher's preferences and politics, and even outright misrepresentation. Quality control systems which should catch major errors seem to be failing in systematic ways as a result of shared priors and commitments between authors, reviewers, and editors, which are also held in common with the journalists and scholars citing and amplifying this work, leading to misinformation cascades, Al-Gharbi writes. For example, Al-Gharbi points out that many of the white voters who proved most decisive for Trump were people who had voted for President Obama, the first black president, in both 2008 and 2012. Does it make sense to claim, as Ta-Nehisi Coates did in an influential Atlantic article, that these voters were motivated by racism and resentment against Obama? If the white voters who ostensibly decided the 2016 election were horrified at the very prospect of a black president, it is unclear why they would have supported Barack Obama's initial campaign, Al-Garbi writes. He adds, similarly, if they were committed to undermining and dismantling the legacy of the first black president, it is not clear why they would have voted to give him 4 years to further entrench his agenda, rather than simply voting for Mitt Romney in 2012. Apparently, instead of resisting Barack Obama in 2008 or 2012, they chose to act on their racial grievances years later in a race between two white people. Moreover, Al-Garbi raises the point that Trump failed to motivate whites to turn out in 2016, and also that he did not win a larger share of the whites who did turn out than Mitt Romney had. And he did better with Hispanics and Asians than Romney had. In fact, Trump won the largest share of the black vote of any Republican since 2004. These are all trends that would continue a steep upward trajectory in 2020. As Al-Garbi writes, given Trump's lower share among whites, it was likely these gains and Democrats' attrition among people of color that put Trump in the White House. Coates et al. Therefore seem committed to arguing that the millions of these blacks, Latinos, and Asians who voted for Trump were also primarily or exclusively motivated by white rage or their commitment to white supremacy, or else conceding that it is possible to vote for Trump for other reasons. And of course, if this is true of minorities, it stands to reason that whites could be similarly motivated by other factors. Far from being motivated by white supremacy, the more likely explanation is that Trump's racism was not a deal breaker for his supporters, many of whom expressed discomfort with the president's ranting and raving. Polling from 2020 shows that even the most diehard Trump fans, those who believe that the 2020 election was stolen from him and that he actually won, would prefer a hypothetical Trumpist politician with more respect for liberal democracy to Trump himself as their candidate in 2024, given the choice. The truth is, the reasons voters themselves give for voting for Trump are numerous and legitimate. Some were motivated by his promise to appoint conservative justices to the bench, a major motivating factor for anti-abortion evangelicals. Others were motivated by his commitment to religious liberty, which gave him a lot of support in the Orthodox Jewish community. Others appreciated his anti-war position, which gave him a lot of support among independents. Still more were impressed by his opposition to America's disastrous trade deals, which found particular support among many low-income voters. Anyone who spent any time talking to Trump voters knew their reasons for voting for him. But as Schaefer and Doherty found in their 2017 Politico analysis, if you're a working journalist, odds aren't just that you work in a pro-Clinton county. Odds are that you reside in one of the nation's most pro-Clinton counties. Journalists at America's leading publications just did not know any Trump supporters socially, making it very easy to caricature and misrepresent them. And when New York Times reporters ventured into Trump country, they inevitably found some reason to tar the people they interviewed as racist. In some ways, it's shocking to see academics and researchers join hands with journalists in distorting this data or in willfully misinterpreting it. But demonizing lower-class whites, specifically by projecting things like racism onto them, has a long history in the United States. As Nancy Eisenberg painstakingly chronicled in White Trash, the media has a long history of pitting poor white and black Americans against each other to the benefit of elites everywhere. It's a dynamic that's being reproduced in thousands of articles written by journalists forcing a false dichotomy between class and race and finding racism at fault when the truth is that the two are inextricable. Moreover, all too often, immigration is used as a stand-in for racism or racial animus. Mutz's questionnaire, like the other studies often cited in mainstream news reports, included questions about whether respondents believe immigrants should or should not get amnesty. Other studies measured support for deporting undocumented immigrants, noting that there was very little support for that view among Trump's supporters. Another study asked respondents if they thought immigrants were more likely to commit crimes and take away jobs. In other words, it explicitly asked people whether their opposition to immigration was economic. And if they said yes, it rated their answer as racism. There was a time when liberals didn't think it was racist to worry about an immigrant taking away a working-class job. While open borders and an end to nation states have long been a mainstay of the radical discourse of the university, in American politics, these views have always been more readily associated with the right, eager for cheap labor and free market trade deals, than with the left, whose focus on protecting working-class Americans led to the desire to limit immigration. In the 1990s, Barbara Jordan, the chair of the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform and the first black woman from the South elected to Congress, wrote that the commission found no national interest in continuing to import lesser skilled and unskilled workers to compete in the most vulnerable parts of our labor force. No less a Democratic personality than Senator Barack Obama wrote about his frustration with mass immigration in his book, The Audacity of Hope. When I see Mexican flags waved at pro-immigration demonstrations, I sometimes feel a flush of patriotic resentment, he wrote in 2006. When I'm forced to use a translator to communicate with the guy fixing my car, I feel a certain frustration. That same year, Paul Krugman, the liberal economics columnist at the New York Times, wrote about the fiscal burden of low-wage immigrants, which reduces the wages of domestic workers who compete with immigrants. And as recently as 2015, during Senator Bernie Sanders' first campaign for president, when asked by Vox's Ezra Klein about immigration during an interview, Sanders was solidly in favor of a strong border. I think if you take global poverty that seriously, it leads you to conclusions that in the U.S. are considered out of political bounds. Things like sharply raising the level of immigration we permit, even up to a level of open borders, Klein said. Open borders, Sanders scoffed. No, that's a Koch brothers proposal. Really? Klein asked. Of course, Sanders said. That's a right-wing proposal, which says essentially there is no United States. It would make a lot of global poor richer, wouldn't it? Klein asked. It would make everybody in America poorer, Sanders responded. You're doing away with the concept of a nation state, and I don't think there's any country in the world that believes in that. If you believe in a nation state or in a country called the United States or UK or Denmark or any other country, you have an obligation, in my view, to do everything we can to help poor people. What right-wing people in this country would love is an open border policy, he went on to say. Bring in all kinds of people, work for $2 or $3 an hour. That would be great for them. I don't believe in that. Far from a racist view, Sanders was voicing the opinion of a large majority of African Americans and Hispanics who told pollsters they would vote for a candidate who stood for strengthening our border security to reduce illegal immigrants. As Al-Garbi has pointed out elsewhere, Black Americans are more supportive of limiting immigration than any other bloc of the Democratic coalition. A Harvard Capps Harris poll found that 85% of Black Americans want less immigration. This shouldn't surprise us. A 2010 study concluded that when it comes to immigration, no racial or ethnic group has benefited less or been harmed more than the nation's African American community. Illegal immigration has been tied to a massive decrease in Black working class wages and up to a 10% increase in the mass incarceration of Black Americans. Another recent study suggests that immigration accounts for a third of the decline in the Black employment rate over the last 40 years. Meanwhile, the Harvard Capps Harris poll also found that 52% of Latinos favor deporting anyone who crosses the border illegally. You wouldn't know this to hear Democratic lawmakers talking or to read the op-ed pages of the country's leading newspapers, which regularly feature calls for open borders and denunciations of people calling for immigration restriction as xenophobic and racist. And as we have seen, opposition to immigration has been labeled racist by sociologists and reporters alike. So it's no surprise that almost every single Democratic candidate running for the 2020 presidential nomination, including Bernie Sanders, who reversed his views to fit with the times, raised their hands during a debate when asked if they would decriminalize illegal border crossing. Open borders were once the calling card of the libertarian right. Now the idea is a humanitarian cri de coeur that flatters the vanity of liberals who benefit from the cheap labor of immigrants, while working-class Americans bearing the burden of this vanity are cast by liberal elites as racist for being afraid they might lose their jobs. The left, once the champion of America's poor and working-class citizens, has become obsessed with the dispossessed of other countries trying to enter the United States. And the term white supremacy, which used to refer to the very real oppression of American minorities by whites, is now a catch-all phrase applied to people who believe in any enforcement of a national border. Even more astonishing is the fact that the further left you go, the more extreme and uncompromising is the call for open borders. Abolish ICE became a rallying cry for progressive firebrand Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in many ways the standard bearer for the new so-called socialist left. Ocasio-Cortez went so far as to suggest that the very idea of a national border is racist. The history of citizenship in the U.S. is deeply woven with the history of racism. It has been used as the legal enforcer of racism for most of U.S. history, she tweeted in 2019. To be sure, President Trump upped the ante of the immigration debate by speaking of immigrants in ugly terms. His cruel family separation policy became inseparably bound up with whatever America First agenda he was trying to implement on behalf of working-class Americans. And the subject brought out other racist comments, like his tweet that Ocasio-Cortez and 3 other freshman congresswomen should go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came, though 3 of them were born in the United States and the 4th is a naturalized citizen, or when he reportedly spoke of Haiti as a shithole country. And no doubt there are some among his supporters who oppose immigration for racist reasons. But there is much evidence to suggest that that's not the case for the majority of them. And if Trump was proposing strong borders out of at least some level of racial animus, the left accepted those terms eagerly. Rather than disputing the idea that any border at all must be a racist endeavor, this became the left's party line. To insist that opposition to immigration is necessarily racist is to erase a class dynamic that privileges the erasers. After all, immigrants make up nearly half of America's household workers. Moreover, those who advocate for strong border control include a large share of America's minority population. If supporting immigration laws is white nationalism, that would mean that there are huge amounts of Black and Latino American white nationalists. This is not the case, needless to say, and labeling anyone racist who questions liberal orthodoxy on immigration, a very recent orthodoxy it bears remembering, is a convenient way to once again erase difficult questions of class from the national conversation. But this particular form of erasure presaged something else too. The mission creep of racism to the southern border was one of the early signs that a new definition of racism, one once relegated to the academic fringe, had become mainstream in our national discourse. Over the course of the next 5 years, it would become the defining paradigm of the liberal news media.
And that was Chapter 6 of Bad News by Badia Unger Sargon. How woke media is undermining democracy. Next week, Chapter 7. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.